So hello, everybody. Come out from behind your screens, please. Always good to see faces. Good morning. Hi, Andy. How are you? Good to see you. Haven't seen you for a while, actually. I've been trying to catch up with you, but you've been ignoring me. Let's talk. I put you on mute now, so you can't answer back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So good morning to everybody in UK and Europe, and good afternoon to those of you in Southeast Asia, and in particular Singapore. Delighted to Hui Hua, how nice to see you there. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for that great talk the other day. So I'm going to be introducing you to Marvin Yeo now, who's been a forum member for some time. And Marvin, I suddenly remembered that one of the times we met, you asked me to join you in a bar, if you remember. It was a sort of restaurant bar. And it was really kind of quite swanky. And I thought, oh, okay, this is Marvin, get to know Marvin. And within sort of 15 to 20 minutes, if you remember, there was suddenly this massive, it was just the two of us sitting there. And there was this massive entourage arrived. And it was the Prime Minister of Singapore and his entourage. Do you remember that? And he swept by. There was about 50 of them around him. I think my only disappointment was he didn't stop to say hello to you. But other than that, I was quite impressed. So Marvin, you very kindly invited Rob to speak to you this afternoon, your time. So I'm going to hand to you two. And as everybody knows, the format will be that Marvin and Rob will speak to each other now for 20 minutes in conversation. And then we will prompt you, but please put your questions in the sidebar and we'll come to you on the 20-minute mark. So Marvin, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for the kind introduction. I believe there's actually three of us there. Mr. Pottinger was also there. But now, thanks again, Simon. Good to see you again. And hello again, Rob.
Marvin.
Let me, can you hear me clearly?
Yes. Thank you for having me today.
All right. Thanks, Rob. So for a start, Rob, could you kindly define the circular economy from your perspective and tell us what led to the creation of Circulate Capital?
So the circular economy is kind of a macroeconomic idea. It's based on the premise that we currently benefit and use what's kind of a linear economy, or take, make, waste economy, where we are extracting resources from the environment. We are making lots of stuff, products, services, and then we waste it. And the circular economy is a concept that says, well, if we've got all of those commodities in cycle, can we bend that curve from linear to circular and use those resources that we've already extracted as the fuel and feedstock for future products and services? And there's a lot of pretty strong economic arguments that it would be cheaper and save us significant money, hundreds of billions of dollars, but also could generate hundreds of billions of dollars of economic growth and millions of jobs, especially in cities, particularly in manufacturing, agriculture, forestry sectors. So there's tremendous opportunity that the circular economy can promise. And so we created Circulate Capital to focus on a particular part of the circular economy, which is around plastics and plastic pollution. We were inspired by an insight that found that most of the plastic that gets into the ocean comes from just a handful of countries in South and Southeast Asia. And that if we invest in recycling and waste infrastructure and advancing the circular economy in this part of the world, we could cut that flow of plastic pollution nearly in half. So we launched the Circulate Capital Ocean Fund, which is about $100 million US. And it's backed by many of the world's largest and leading corporations. So Unilever, Danone, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Procter & Gamble, and several others. And we invest in market-based solutions, companies and technologies, particularly in South and Southeast Asia, that build a market for this waste plastic that ends up into the environment and instead pulls it into the value chains of these large corporates that we're investing on behalf of. And that's why it becomes kind of a supply chain investment program that we've developed as part of Circulate Capital.
Oh, no, thanks for that, Rob. Most interesting. Since the Biden administration has come into power, have you seen much stronger political will on the part of governments and large institutional investors to acknowledge and address environmental issues? Has that been a sea change in the last few months?
I think we've definitely seen some increased activity in governments and institutions. I've certainly noticed a massive convergence around the climate impact and climate action spaces. For the last 4 years, the U.S. has withdrawn from most of the climate dialogues, and I think there was this sort of huge pent-up demand, pent-up action as a result of Biden administration coming into office. We've also seen a lot of activity in what's known as ESG in the public markets. We've seen, Larry Fink and other sort of corporate leaders and financial institution leaders talking a lot more about improving environmental, social governance issues. From our corporate partners, the companies that I mentioned earlier, we've started to hear a lot from them that they're getting increased pressure from institutional investors. It's showing up now on quarterly calls more frequently than it ever has in the past. And I think that's, the Biden administration and some of the opportunity that, or at least energy that's created has definitely helped accelerate that. We haven't seen too much of it in the private markets yet. I think there's still a lot of capital waiting on the sidelines. And I think many governments are still a little bit in wait and see mode. There's still a lot of talk, but I think also there's a lot of confidence in the US that's been shaken. There's another election only 2 years away. And there's mostly expects that, the Democrats will lose the House, which means, we could see not a lot of progress in the second half of this administration. So I think there's a lot of a cautious optimism, but not a lot of action as a result of that uncertainty.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, over here, we've actually been seeing much stronger interest on the parts of, like the likes of PTT in Thailand and Petronas in Malaysia, NEA over here to move towards a hydrogen economy, dealing with waste to hydrogen. So, yes. I mean, that's all quite encouraging. Now, what do you think are the most pressing environmental issues we face today, and what are more innovative solutions that you've come across?
And just to build on the point you were saying, I think the petrochemical industry is experiencing tremendous pressure, and some of that activity you described is we've also seen, and Dow and Chevron Phillips Chemical are two of our investors, and we hear from them pretty actively about how they see that hydrogen economy being part of their future, and there's much more acceptance of that idea than there ever was before, I think. I think obviously I've dedicated myself to fighting plastic pollution. That's sort of the primary environmental issue that I think we have a lot of urgency around. Right now, there's a couple 100 million tons of plastic that are in the ocean. It increases by 10 million tons a year. That's the same as a garbage truck emptying a load of plastic into the ocean every minute. So there's a lot of urgency there. But I'm motivated by that, not just because of how disgusting it is to see plastic in our ocean, but there is a huge climate impact to that too. And I think, as I just noted, climate change is probably the most pressing environmental issue, and that's why we've seen so much momentum in that coming out of the Biden administration and other entities like the ones you're talking about. But from our perspective, a lot of fighting climate change is not just about renewable energy or some of what you'd expect to have a climate conversation around. And some of the research has found that moving to fully renewable energy systems could only address maybe half of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And things like the circular economy, I think, have the potential to tackle the remaining half. And if you start taking a look at some of the larger supply chains, steel, plastic, aluminum, cement, food, you can start to widen your lens to think not just about waste, but about how these systems are fully integrated and have incredible climate impacts as part of them. And so for us, as we think about the innovative solutions, we like to think about investing through or using circular economy as a lens to identify exciting investment opportunities that can advance the circular economy, prevent plastic pollution, but also fight climate change. And so, one example I'll give is a company we're preparing to make an investment in. They have developed a technology in phase change materials, which is an innovative material that can improve the cold chain. And if you think about insulation, most of the cold chain today uses things like styrofoam to keep temperature in, where a phase change materials actually operates like a thermal battery, which allows you to have much more precise temperature control for a much longer period of time. And that was an exciting opportunity just in general. But as we looked at one company called Phase Change Solutions, they had developed a superior product using bio-based polymers. So they were able to build a phase change material using a biopolymer approach that reduces the carbon footprint of that product, reduces waste throughout the value chain, and improves energy efficiency of the cold chain, which helps reduce food waste, helps improve pharmaceutical deployment. So that it's an opportunity that we've been excited about because it has a wide variety of impacts.
Well, thanks, Rob. Now, you mentioned earlier that most of the plastic waste in the world actually comes from this extended region. What have you seen on the parts of what have you seen in the region in terms of the various governments of the various countries or the private sector in these countries? How much have they done to address the issue, and what are awareness levels like within the region?
A few years ago, a study came out, and I mentioned it. What they found was most of the plastic gets into the ocean, from this region, but they actually ranked countries. And if there's one thing that gets, I think, Asian countries' attention or government's attention in this part of the world is being on the top of a list that says you're the #1 plastic polluter, right? Mm-hmm. And so that created a lot of momentum and energy and spotlight. Indonesia was ranked. So China was #1, is #1. Indonesia is #2. Philippines is #3 in terms of plastic leaking into the environment. And that really put a spotlight on this region that hadn't really existed before. We've seen governments, especially Indonesia, secondarily, I'd say Vietnam. India has been ahead of the curve on this and started this journey. Prime Minister Modi ran on a platform of cleanliness 10 years ago and has continued to drive a lot of activity. I think we've seen Indonesia start to pass national legislation. Vietnam is behind it. We haven't seen the execution yet. There's been a lot of national platform creation, commitments, targets, frameworks. But that's still a big step away from executing a policy nationally at the local, but it has to be done at the local level. That's one of the challenging things about waste and recycling is it's a global problem, but all waste is managed locally. And so that means the village or desa, the regency, the state, the city, there's a lot of political complexities that I think are holding back a lot of the action we need to see in the region.
Oh, thanks, Rob. Now, as a final question, because it seems to be a few members of the audience who already have questions lined up, can you transport us into the future and share your vision of a circular economy, and how long do you think this would take to eventuate?
I think the aspiration and the promise of the circular economy is that we can meet the needs of future generations with the resources that we've already extracted from the earth. Where we don't need to continue to drill for oil to make plastic, but that the plastics we need, we're able to use our old plastics as that feedstock. Same thing with aluminum, same thing with food. And there's a couple key parts in there that I think will be required of society. We're going to have to reduce consumption. We're going to have to change how we consume and how much we consume. Because so much of this, and especially in this part of the world, has been driven by rapid economic development. We now consume in South and Southeast Asia as much per capita as many parts of the Western world. And that's just not sustainable, financially and environmentally. And that means, we're gonna have to consume differently, consume less. We're gonna have to reuse more. We're looking at business models that can base on refill or reuse rather than single use, which has been so much of how our supply chains and economies have functioned. And then ultimately, it's how do we keep those molecules in play, right? Not think about it just as a recycling project or plan, but these are molecules that we can keep in the supply chain and in the economy. And I think that's sort of the pathway we're headed on, is to think about that at the molecule level.
Oh, thanks, Rob. Now,
Marvin, Rob, thank you so much for that. I'm going to, as you alluded, Marvin, that we've got a number of questions coming in. So if you're happy for me, I'm just going to jump in here and get those questions to the two of you. Actually, first question, Rob, is there you are. You're clearly American. What are you doing in Singapore and why are you there?
I found myself in a unique situation a few years ago when this topic really started becoming top of mind for CEOs and governments and consumers around the world. And I was in a unique position where I felt like I could really make a difference and pull off creating this investment fund focused on these solutions. And this is where the work is. We developed a strategy to do it here, and you can't really phone this in from New York.
Sure. No, it's interesting. I wonder what your answer would be to that, because you mentioned earlier in the conversation that, the majority of the problem in terms of plastic and oceans is in the Asian regions. Is that the prime reason why you moved to Singapore?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No,
okay.
I set up my company here and tried to make it happen.
Okay, excellent. Well, look, Hugo, I'm gonna come to you first. Are you there to ask your question? Yeah. Hugo Walkinshaw.
I am.
Here he is.
Yep. Rob, thanks for that. Just a quick question around the practicality of the circular economy. My question really is, does it lend itself better to a sort of closed loop supply chain within a national economy where you've got common interests, proximity, kind of standardized government regulations, etc.? There's a sort of a big what's in it for me, as opposed to a complex supply chain that goes from east to west or west to east, where actually there's less, it's bloody hard to regulate and kind of less obvious shared interests.
I mean, I think it's a both and, right? I think there is, and we've seen this kind of shift where export and import of plastic waste has become a major challenge. China shut its borders almost 6 years ago to plastic waste. Most of Southeast Asia followed suit, and the rest of the world just added plastic waste to what's called the Basel Convention, basically treating it as hazardous waste. The ability to export plastic waste is now as difficult as it is to export nuclear waste. So it's gotten a lot more complicated. And I think what that drives is that local economy, right? That you can recycle and build a circular economy in your community. And in your nation. It certainly makes it easier to regulate. As you said, you're not going to be able to do international tax schemes on plastic. It's quite difficult. But I don't know that they're mutually exclusive. I think there are parts of the circular economy that lend itself to services and refill models and things like that in a single country or a single location. But I also think international trade is critical to achieving the scale that you need to make these systems work, right? We spend all this money and resource making products and shipping them around the world. it's going to be very difficult to just manage them at those small scales. The circular economy requires that full closed loop. And so that's, I think, a big part of what's needed as well.
Okay, thank you. And Marvin, can I jump in here and ask you, you run your private equity fund, and I know that the circular economy is something in which you've been interested for a while. Just talk me through your mindset on why you're investing more and more within this sector.
Well, I've essentially been impact focused in my work and business for well over a decade, from the time I was at the Asian Development Bank through to time I was setting up country funds for various frontier markets. But since realizing that country funds were quite restricted, raising funds, these funds were small. It was very difficult to raise money. I wanted to look at sectors that were a lot more impactful. That was what essentially led me to circular economy and the waste treatment space. So these days, we look at quite a lot of things in the waste to energy technology space. So we're looking at the plasma gasification of various kinds of waste with hydrogen as an offtake. We're looking at converting, and these are proven models. This has been proven in the US. It's been around for a decade. Rob actually knows the company very well because we're working on a project together. And then also looking at things like converting food waste to compressed biogas. And that's something which has already been successfully deployed in India. And we are looking at bringing the technology, incorporating this is a Singapore company with a view to taking this out across the region. So we will be able to scale up nicely once we are done with the exercise. And also in the industrial wastewater treatment space, there's a lot of potential to take technologies that have been developed here. We work very closely with the Nanyang Environmental and Water Research Institute. So the idea is to take some of these technologies and spread it around the region. So what led me to this sector was to be able to create impact on a large scale. But at the same time, the economics of many of these deals and projects are actually very interesting, as they're almost as good as standalone private sector or normal private equity deals. So I think the future is very bright for the sector.
Okay, thank you very much. And it goes without saying, everybody, that should you wish to speak to Marvin or Rob post this call, just be in touch and I will forward that on. Ingrid in Vienna, come forward. Yes. And ask a question.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I have two questions. The first one was partly answered already because you talked about the plastic waste in Asia and how substantial it is. What do you think about the other continents, the other countries, China, USA, and also the African states with respect to that? And the other question I had was more or less on the idea of circular economy, which is very important, that once you start changing something, it seems like another question opens up. So you start changing a product cycle or logistics in terms of adapting it to circular economy. And then there are other questions arising, other effects that might be bad or good, or just urge you to start a new cycle of thought about changing, other arrangements around it. I think it's a very general way of formulating right now, but I mean that it seems like there's always a problem opening up when you start thinking about circular economy. It's a beautiful thing, but then you would have to change the whole world almost, in each and every aspect.
Yeah. Well, so to your first question, the ocean plastic problem is really a litter problem, and I'd say most of the Western world took care of its litter problem over the last 50 to 100 years, over which it's had its economic growth. Most of South and Southeast Asia and China had that economic growth over a 15-year period, and it was kind of hard to keep that infrastructure at pace with the growth. And that's why we have plastic entering to the ocean at such massive rates. And the type of plastic, how we consume, the type of packaging has really evolved a lot over the last 50 years. Most of the recycling systems we have were built for heavy, rigid cans and bottles. And now everything's inflexible, low value, very low value plastic. So it's hard to make the economics work, which is what's driven a lot of the focus on this part of the world. I think Africa, is the next, most of the folks in our space, in our world are talking about Africa being the next area of focus. I think it's largely a lack of data is why it hasn't been on the radar as much as this region of the world. And then, just briefly on the circular economy, I think it's an aspirational idea. And there are purists in the space that, anytime you go down that path, they start to say, well, that's not circular enough. But, there are trade-offs in all of environmental sustainability, in my view. Part of this is always managing those types of complexities and trying to figure out what's the right way to go forward. But, I think circular economy identifies some problems, but it also identifies lots of opportunities. And that's why we've tried to build an investment strategy around it.
So we've got a number of questions coming in, which is going to take us over the mark. So what I'm going to do is make sure, Rob and Marvin, that you receive these questions post this call, and maybe you'd be keen to answer those for me, please. But Ian, there you are sitting in Lausanne. Can you come forward and ask your question, please?
Okay, in fact, I had a second question. So the first one was, do you have concrete use cases? Because I hear one is recycling plastic is incredibly difficult to do. That's it's very, even PET is very complex to recycle. There must be other stuff that are even harder. That's the first part of the question. It got me thinking. The second thing is, well, how much government subsidy or regulation will be required to get us up the curve where the whole thing is self-sustaining? It's like a number of things. We need government intervention just to get to the point where we have learned how to do it efficiently. So there's two parts to the question.
Yeah. So, we're investors in the space, so we generally believe that actually recycling can be economically viable. And we've seen it happen. We've invested in about $40 million in SMEs across South and Southeast Asia. These are profitable enterprises that have, capital has never flowed into. They've never had growth as a potential before. In India, we helped finance two of the first food grade facilities. So right now, all of the PET plastic that you mentioned is imported for bottle grade. They don't use any domestic supply because no one had ever built a food grade recycling facility before. So, those are the types of opportunities that we see. I mean, India, Indonesia, parts of this region have the highest PET recycling rates in the world, 80, 90% in some cities, because there's enough value in that material to collect, sort, process, and sell it to an end market. Most of it goes into textiles and polyester fiber. So the systems can work, but they do require engineering and re-engineering and investment. And I think our view is that the lack of investment has been really what's been holding it back.
And also, Rob, allow me to add, Ian, back to your second question. Government subsidies would generally, subsidies would generally be more relevant to emerging market or developing economies, because in these countries, the tipping fee regime is generally not very well developed from regulatory perspective. So, like in the US, for example, you would get up to $500 to up to $1,000 a ton for say medical or toxic waste, but in emerging markets where the regulatory framework is not very well defined, and where there's no proper recourse to people who violate its regulations, people who are in the waste to energy space would have to rely on a much higher PPA or a much more attractive offtake, and that's where the government has to come in to make it possible, right? So it really varies from country to country, but in in the developed countries, these technologies, many of these technologies do not require a government subsidy to be commercially viable, and they provide pretty interesting returns.
Okay, well, thank you so much, both to Rob and Marvin, for your time today. It's much appreciated. Sorry, Rob, Garrett, and Patrick Cook, that I wasn't able to get to you, but I will make sure that your questions get to Rob and Marvin and put you guys in the loop together. So Thursday, for those of you who are in Europe and London, we have a talk based for the US membership on Bitcoin. And so look forward to that. Please join us. It's 5 o'clock UK time. And I look forward to that. Thank you again to everybody, and have a very good day. Have a very good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.